the town where no one had a shadow after midnight. It was long after midnight when Daniel Mercer first realized that the world around him had quietly, almost politely, stepped out of alignment with everything he had ever understood about light, perception, and the quiet agreement reality makes with those who move through it, unaware of how fragile that agreement actually is. The town of Marrow Creek, an isolated place tucked between forested hills and an unnaturally still river that reflected too clearly to be natural, had always been a quiet town. The kind of place that felt like it was waiting for something without knowing what it was waiting for. But tonight, something had shifted in a way that could never be unshifted. Something had slipped loose in the machinery of the world, and Daniel would later swear he felt the exact second it happened, as if the universe itself had inhaled sharply but never exhaled again. He had been walking home from the late shift at the diner, the humid air sticking to his skin, the warm yellow glow of the streetlights stretching over the pavement in long, soft cones that reminded him of stage lighting in some forgotten theater. It was a small town, and he'd walked this route 1,000 times, boots scuffing the same cracks in the sidewalk, passing the same shuttered storefronts with their dusty displays and faded open signs that had not been flipped in months. He had always found comfort in the repetition, in the gentle sameness of things. But the comfort turned to unease when he noticed, on the corner of Pine and Willow, that the streetlight behind him cast no shadow of his body at all. At first, he thought the bulb had burned out. It happened often enough, old lamps flickering, buzzing, dying for no reason other than age. But when he glanced back, the lamp was still glowing, quietly, steadily, as if nothing had changed. Yet the ground beneath him remained stubbornly blank, showing only the worn asphalt and the faint chalk outline of some long-forgotten hopscotch pattern from children who had grown up and moved away years ago. No shape, no silhouette, nothing at all. Daniel frowned, lifting his hands slowly, watching the movement, watching the empty pavement fail to respond in any way. And it was the stillness of that failure, the absolute refusal of the world to produce the expected result, that planted the first seed of panic low in his stomach. Shadows were not optional. They were automatic, unavoidable, the faithful and obedient companions of all things touched by light. For him, not to have one was not merely strange, it was impossible. A rational voice in his mind, a tired voice that reminded him of clocks and physics and school lessons, whispered that it had to be an illusion, a trick, a misperception caused by fatigue. But another voice, the deeper, older voice, the one that came from the part of the mind that still remembered how to fear the dark, told him this was something else entirely. Something that didn't care about the rules he lived by. Something that had been waiting for him to notice. He took a step back. Still nothing. The pavement remained empty. He stepped forward again, under a different lamp. Still nothing. His shadow was gone. And once he saw it, he realized the town was too quiet for this hour. The dogs that usually barked in the distance were silent. The river, which always murmured faintly, as if telling secrets only the water knew, had gone still. The trees didn't rustle. The wind had died. The air was so still that it felt like the entire world was holding its breath around him. "Maybe it's just me," he muttered under his breath, though he knew the words were hollow, knew they carried no comfort, no explanation. But he didn't truly believe it until he reached the corner store and saw Mrs. Adler, elderly, hunched, carrying her reusable bag as always, freeze mid-step as she stared at the pavement beneath her feet with the same dawning horror that had begun clawing its way up his spine. Her shadow was gone, too. She lifted her cane, waved it experimentally, searching for the dark echo she had lived with for over 80 years. But the ground remained blank. Her mouth opened slowly, trembling, as if forming a word she hadn't needed to speak since she was a child. "No," she whispered. "Not again." Daniel blinked. "Wait, again? What do you mean again?" But Mrs. Adler didn't answer. Instead, she began to back away, tears forming in her eyes, whispering something too quiet for him to hear, something that sounded more like a prayer than a memory. The silence deepened, and then Daniel realized something even worse. No street lamp was casting shadows for anything at all. Not the trees, not the parked cars, not the benches, not the stop signs or mailboxes or fences. Marrow Creek had become a town of perfect, impossible light, light that illuminated everything without producing a single shadow, light that acted like it had forgotten what darkness was. Daniel tried to steady his breath, but a cold pulse started behind his ribs, a sense that the air itself was watching him, that unseen eyes had opened all across the town the moment the clock struck midnight. He looked at the horizon, where the forest met the sky, and noticed a faint, shimmering distortion, like heat rippling off asphalt. Only it wasn't heat. This was cold. A spreading, expanding cold that seemed to erase the shape of things, softening the edges of every tree, every hill, as if the world itself was being erased piece by piece with the gentlest, most deliberate touch. "Something's wrong," Daniel whispered to himself. Something's been switched off." But he was wrong. Something had been switched on. Behind him, a door creaked open. He turned sharply, expecting someone, anyone, to step into the pale, shadowless light with him. But no one appeared. The door hung open, swaying slightly though there was no wind. And inside the house, where darkness should have waited in corners and under furniture, there was no darkness at all. The interior glowed faintly, as if lit from within by something that wasn't light, but wasn't darkness either. Something that made the hair on Daniel's arms rise and the cold pulse in his chest intensify. He took one hesitant step closer, peering inside. And that was when he saw it. On the far wall, above a modest wooden table, hung a framed photograph of a family, a mother, a father, and a little girl with pigtails and a missing front tooth. Their shadows were missing, too. Not faint, not fading, completely gone. Only their bodies remained captured in the image, floating strangely against the background, unnatural in their separation from the light. Daniel staggered back, heart pounding, breath skipping, brain refusing to fit this into any category of explanation it had access to. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But before he could finish the thought, something flickered near the edge of his vision, something quick, something low to the ground, something that moved not like a living creature, but like the absence of one. He spun, searching the street, trying to see where it had gone. But there was nothing. No shape, no motion. Just that shimmering distortion at the edge of town, growing stronger, spreading inward. The air seemed to vibrate, a low hum he felt through his bones more than heard with his ears. Mrs. Adler's voice quivered from behind him. "They're back." Daniel swallowed hard. "Who's back?" But she didn't answer. She just pointed, her hand shaking uncontrollably, toward the horizon where the distortion grew thicker, darker, deeper, as if the world beyond the forest was beginning to fold inward. And as Daniel squinted, trying to pierce the haze, he saw them. At first, they looked like people. Tall, thin silhouettes drifting just beyond the tree line, moving in slow, careful motions as though feeling their way into a space they had not occupied for a long time. But something was wrong. Their bodies moved, but their edges flickered, soft, blurred, unstable, like reflections in rippling water. And where their shadows should have been, there was only nothing. Not absence, not blankness, a hungry void. A hole cut into the world. A shape that devoured the light around it. Daniel stumbled back again, the cold inside him turning sharp, jagged, as though the air itself were cutting into his lungs. What are those?" Mrs. Adler closed her eyes, and for the first time in his life, Daniel heard true fear in another person's voice. Not panic, not shock, but ancient, bone-deep terror. "Those," she whispered, "are our shadows." Mrs. Adler's words did not land in Daniel's mind like a sentence. They dropped into him like a stone thrown into deep water, vanishing at first, then sending slow, widening ripples through the parts of his consciousness that still believed in normalcy, in physics, in the idea that the world was a fixed, solid thing that did not suddenly start behaving like a waking nightmare simply because the clock passed midnight. "Our shadows," he repeated dumbly, because sometimes the only thing the mind can do with a horror too large to process is hold it up like a mirror and see if, when reflected, it looks any smaller. She nodded once, the movement so slight it was almost a flinch. "They never stay gone for long," she murmured, voice thin and brittle like paper left too long in the sun. "They always come back, just not as they were." The silhouettes at the tree line shifted again, closer now, or larger, or both. They didn't move like living things. There was no simple stride, no recognizable gait, no weight landing in each step. They slid, elongated, bent at unnatural angles, and then snapped back, distortion walking in the shape of a person, like something that had watched humans from behind glass and was now trying to imitate them with a body made of wrong material. Daniel realized his mouth had gone completely dry. "That's impossible," he said, but the word felt ridiculous even as it left his lips. Impossible had already packed its bags and left the town the moment his shadow vanished from the pavement. Mrs. Adler turned to look at him, and in the shadowless light, if it could even be called that, he could see a history in her eyes that didn't belong to the last few minutes, or even to the last few years. There was memory there, the heavy kind that bends people into themselves. "How old are you, Daniel?" She asked instead of answering. He blinked. 32. She nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. "Then the last time this happened," she said quietly, "you were not yet born." The word last did something to his spine. He felt vertebrae clench. "Last time what happened?" he asked, though he already knew what she would say. When midnight came, Mrs. Adler whispered, glancing at the horizon the way a devout woman might glance at an altar, and shadows left and did not come back as shadows. He swallowed hard, the motion painful. Why haven't I ever heard about this? Something like this, happening here. A wry, broken sound escaped her, almost but not quite a laugh. "You think we talk about this?" she said, and there was bitterness in it, and something like shame. "You think we put it in the tourist brochures? Visit Marrow Creek, population 3,000 and dropping, where the shadows walk away from their owners every few decades and come back hungry? No, Daniel. We bury it, same as we buried the people afterwards." He stared at her. "People died?" She held his gaze without flinching. "People died," she said, "and a few." She hesitated, and in that hesitation, he sensed the part of the story that never made it to words, the unspeakable core. A few kept living, but they weren't really themselves anymore. Not all the way. The silhouettes beyond the tree line were closer now. He could see more detail, though detail brought no comfort. Their limbs flickered at the edges, like flame about to go out, then surged back into shape, anchored by something unseen. For the briefest second, one of their faces turned toward town, and Daniel felt, not saw, but felt, attention touch him specifically, as if an eye of pure absence had locked on to where he was standing. He shivered violently. How does that even happen?" he asked. "How does a shadow leave?" Mrs. Adler stared at the street for a long moment, then took a deep, shaky breath, as if she were about to step into cold water. "You think of your shadow as something your body makes," she said slowly, choosing each word with painful care. "But that's only halfway true. Light draws the line, but something else fills it. We are not only flesh, boy, we are outlines. We exist as shapes as much as meat. Our shadows are the proof of that, places where we displace light simply by existing." Daniel frowned despite himself. "You're saying, what? That our shadows are like shells?" "Not shells," she said. "Mirrors, echoes, negative impressions of ourselves. We walk, they follow. We turn, they turn. We live, they are dragged behind us on the ground like signatures that say, 'I am here.'" She looked back toward the horizon. "And sometimes," she continued, "that echo gets tired of being dragged." The idea hit him so hard, he almost laughed just to shake it off. "You're telling me my shadow just got up and left because it was tired?" "No," she snapped, more sharply than he'd ever heard her speak. "I'm telling you that at certain times, in certain places, when the world tilts just so." She held up a trembling hand, fingers slightly curved, like she was miming the angle of some invisible planet. "The part of you that gets left on walls and floors and sidewalks realizes it doesn't have to be tied to your heels, that it can step away, that it can step out." A faint ringing started deep in Daniel's ears, like the distant echo of a tuning fork. "And what happens when it does?" he asked, though the silhouettes at the tree line already looked like part of the answer. "It learns," Mrs. Adler said. "It learns what it's like to walk without you, to move without being attached, to stretch itself in directions you never thought of, to exist without having to obey your choices." Her voice dropped lower. "And if it stays away long enough, it stops wanting to come back." Daniel shook his head. "But they're just absence, just darkness. They're not real." She tilted her chin toward the horizon. "Do they look unreal to you?" He followed her gaze. One of the figures had stepped out of the tree line entirely now, moving into the no-man's land between forest and town. In the strange, sourceless light, its outline was sharp as a cut, a hole in the air where something should be but wasn't, and yet it was undeniably there. Where it passed, the world behind it seemed to warp slightly, the edges of houses and parked cars bending, stretching, like the silhouette was not merely blocking the view but editing it. A second shape emerged, a third, a fourth. "How far do they come?" Daniel whispered. Mrs. Adler did not answer that question directly. Instead, she said, "You know what I remember most from the first time? It wasn't the fear. It wasn't the deaths." Her eyes were distant now, not in front of her, but in some overlay of another night laid atop this one. It was the sound. What sound? The sound of people realizing they no longer had a shadow, she said. Some screamed, some prayed, some laughed like it was a joke. But there was always this one little pause. That moment when you look down and something that has always been there simply isn't. That small, sharp inhalation when you feel lighter but not in a good way. That's how I know when it started. He realized she was right. His own reaction, standing under the streetlight earlier, had been exactly that. Not loud, not dramatic, just a stunned private intake of breath, as if the world had quietly removed one of its unwritten guarantees. Did they tell anyone? He asked. The government? Scientists? Anyone? A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Do you really think anyone believes my shadow walked away from me? She asked. At most, they send a doctor, a therapist, maybe some priest with holy water. The phenomenon never repeats exactly the same way. And by the time someone from the outside comes to look, the night has passed. The shadows have gone back to pretending, and half the people who saw it have either died, moved away, or convinced themselves it was a dream. She gave him a long, slow look. But we don't forget, she said. We can't forget. Not when we live on streets where people once stood there and then didn't. A rising, insectile hum vibrated through the soles of his shoes. He realized, with a chill that went straight to his bones, that the sound was coming up through the ground itself. Stone, soil, pipes, carrying something from the forest into the heart of town. Why now? He demanded. Why tonight? What changed? Everything, she said simply, and nothing. The town's built where it's built. The river bends where it bends. The hill lines up where it lines up. Sometimes, she tapped her temple with a knuckle, the sky's arrangement above us matches whatever parasites crawl in the dark beneath us. And when that happens, midnight is not just a time, it's a key. The figures had nearly reached the first row of houses now. They moved with the terrible patience of tides. Go home, Daniel, she said suddenly, and her voice, though softer, had the firm authority of someone used to giving instructions that meant the difference between survival and becoming a story people whispered about years later. Lock your doors. Close your curtains. Do not look outside after the church bell marks 1 o'clock. Do not look at your walls. And whatever you hear, she glanced toward the forest, eyes narrowing, do not answer if anything that sounds like you calls your name. He stared at her. What about you? She smiled sadly. My time's almost up anyway, she said. Yours isn't. That's the whole point. He shook his head, something stubborn in him pushing back. I can't just go home and pretend this isn't happening. You're not pretending, she said. You're surviving. A fresh surge of motion at the horizon drew their eyes. One of the silhouettes had broken ahead of the others, a long, spidery shape that seemed to expand and contract with each movement, its form stretching up walls that weren't there yet and then compressing back to human height. It was moving fast. You remember your address? Mrs. Adler asked suddenly. The question was so mundane it took him a second to process it. Of course I remember my address, he said. Say it, she insisted. 42 Birch Lane. She nodded. Good. Keep saying it in your head when you walk, she said. Say it like a line on a map, like coordinates, like an anchor. These things love people who forget where they're going. I'm not a child, he protested. She looked past him, toward something he could not see, and when her gaze met his again, there was something like apology in it. Tonight, she said, everyone is. For a moment, he considered grabbing her arm, insisting she come with him. But there was something immovable in her posture. An old tree that had long since decided where it would stand when the storm came, and beneath that, a quiet certainty that she knew the rules of this night in a way he did not. So he did the only thing left. He nodded once, turned, and began to walk. The town felt different now, as if the streets had shifted between the time he'd arrived at the corner store and now. He didn't recognize how that difference manifested. There were no buildings out of place, no sudden alleys where none should be, no impossible architecture. Instead, it was subtler. The silence between houses was thicker. The space between one street lamp and the next felt longer than it should have. Doorways seemed deeper. Windows stared longer. He walked faster. 42 Birch Lane, he whispered under his breath. 42 Birch Lane. He passed the laundromat. Dark, the machines like rows of metal eyes. The hardware store, closed, a handwritten sign in the window advertising some long-past sale, letters warped by the heat and years. The florist with its dead plants in the display, petals brown and curled, as if time had forgotten to move inside that glass box long before tonight. In each and every window he passed, he saw the same thing. People standing very still, too still, their faces pale in the artificial light of their homes, their eyes turned toward the street, but never fully at him, as if they were looking into some space just behind him, just to the left of him, just out of reach. None of them had shadows either. Some clutched curtains in white knuckles. Some held children close. Some simply stared, the hollow look of people who had spent a lifetime waiting for something they hoped would never arrive, and now that it had no script for what came next. 42 Birch Lane, he repeated, forcing his voice to stay steady. 42 Birch Lane. He turned on to Sycamore, then crossed to Maple. The numbering in Marrow Creek never made much sense. Streets had been added in chunks over decades, a strange patchwork of planning that meant addresses were more superstition than logic. But he knew his way home by muscle memory, past the old library with the boarded-up back entrance, across the small park whose swings rocked gently in the still air without any wind to move them, down the narrow alley that shaved a block and a half off his commute. He hesitated at the mouth of that alley tonight. In the best of times, it was a narrow throat between two brick buildings, choked with dumpsters and stray cats and the faint smell of oil that never washed away. Tonight, it was a black slit in the world, not because the light didn't reach it, but because it didn't seem to want the light. The shadowlessness stopped at its edge. Beyond that, he saw a darkness that was not simply deeper, but different. It was the only place so far that looked like the old world, where a body might cast a silhouette, where dimensions still behaved, where light and dark still negotiated. He realized with a small shiver that in any other circumstance he would have welcomed that darkness. Tonight, it looked like a trap. Something moved there, a flicker, low, near the ground, then high, along the wall, then nothing. He took a step back. No shortcut tonight, he decided. He turned and took the long road instead. As he walked, the humming under his feet grew louder. At first, he thought it was traffic on some distant highway, but there were no highways near Marrow Creek. Then he wondered if it was a train, but the tracks had been removed 20 years ago. The more he listened, the more he realized it wasn't like any human-made sound at all. It was too smooth, too constant, the way a single sustained note played forever would sound if you could endure listening long enough. He risked a glance back toward the forest. He wished he hadn't. The silhouettes had multiplied. Dozens now, maybe hundreds, spread along the horizon like a seam of infection at the edge of the world. Some were tall and thin, others warped and compact. Some crawled along the ground, moving in a way that made his muscles ache just to watch. Others towered, stretching up invisibly toward a sky that seemed suspiciously empty of stars. One of them was nearer than the others. Much nearer. It stood at the end of the street he had just been on, half in view behind Mrs. Klein's mailbox. Its shape was wrong in a way that made his breath stutter. Where its head should be, the darkness bulged as if swollen. Its arms dangled too low, nearly to the ground, flickering in and out of the edges of reality like a bad projection. And then, suddenly, horribly, he recognized the outline of the jacket it was wearing. His jacket. The realization struck like ice water down his back. It moved. The thing turned its knot face toward him, and though he saw no eyes, no mouth, no features at all, he knew without doubt it was looking at him, directly, intimately, as if seeing past skin and bone to the place inside him that had just realized what it was leaking. It took a step forward. He turned and ran. He wasn't proud of how quickly his composure shattered. One second he was walking fast. The next he was sprinting, his boots pounding the pavement with wild, uneven impacts, breath tearing in his throat. Street names blurred. Landmarks became streaks of familiar shapes smeared by motion and adrenaline. 42 Birch Lane, he gasped between breaths. 42 Birch Lane. He didn't dare look back. The town, to its credit, did not shift beneath him. It let him run. Houses stayed where they were supposed to be. Intersections appeared where memory said they would. The universe did not add extra blocks to trap him in an endless loop the way his fear half expected it might. He reached Birch Lane, heart hammering, sweat chilling instantly on his skin in the unnatural cold. The houses on Birch were small, most of them single-story, with peeling paint and sagging porches and yards that were either overtended or not tended at all. Many of the windows glowed from within, pale rectangles of light, behind which he could see silhouettes not moving, standing still, listening. He forced himself not to count. His house was near the end, a squat, slightly crooked structure with a patchy lawn and a porch step that had been cracked since before he'd moved in. Normally he found the place unremarkable in the best way possible. It was his. It stayed where he left it. The roof didn't leak. Tonight, it might as well have been the last safe point in a collapsing maze. He stumbled up the front walk, nearly tripping over the loose paving stone he'd been meaning to fix, his key already in his hand. The lock resisted for one fraction of a second, too long, far too long, before turning with a small, sticky click. He slammed the door behind him and threw the deadbolt, then the chain, then, for no rational reason at all, dragged the small hallway table in front of the door as well. It would do nothing against anything that could make shadows leave their bodies, but his shaking muscles needed to do something. Inside, the house felt wrong in a different way. Not because of the silence, though that was there, not because of the light, though his lamps burned steady and shadowless as the streetlights had. It felt wrong because it knew him. Every object was familiar. Every scuff mark had a story. Every squeak in the floor had once been a comfort. Now, all those little intimate details had become accomplices. He closed the curtains in the living room, hands fumbling on the fabric, breath still coming in ragged gulps. The curtains fell, shutting out the sight of the street. The house became its own small, floating world. He flicked off the overhead light and turned on only the lamp beside the couch. The bulb glowed with a soft amber tone that should have been gentle. It cast its light across the coffee table, the carpet, his shoes. No shadow, not even a hint. He stared at the empty floor where his silhouette should be and felt the ground inside his understanding crack another inch. "What do you want?" he whispered. And though he wasn't sure who he was asking, the town, the night, whatever stood at the edge of the forest in his jacket, he felt the question hang in the air like bait. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He jerked, nearly leaping out of his skin. For one surreal moment, he felt a ridiculous spike of ordinary irritation. "Now my phone works?" He fumbled it out, hands slick with sweat. No signal icon appeared. No carrier name. No bars, just a single notification. "Unknown sender. Do not stand where you stood at midnight." His skin prickled. Another line appeared as he watched, the letters crawling into existence one by one as if being typed from nowhere. "And do not look at the walls when they come back." Before he could respond, before he could even think to respond, the screen went black. The phone powered down. He pressed the button. Nothing. Held it. Nothing. It was as dead as if the battery had been removed. Slowly, very slowly, Daniel turned his head and looked at the nearest wall. It was blank, just off-white paint in need of a refresh, the faint square where a picture had once hung and left a cleaner patch beneath. Nothing moved. Nothing lurked. Still, he took a step back from it. From the kitchen came a soft sound, a click. Not loud, not sharp, just a small, deliberate adjustment, like someone very carefully setting something down on a glass surface. He froze. "Hello?" he called out, hating the way his voice trembled. No answer. The refrigerator hummed in its normal way. The clock on the stove glowed 12:17 in calm green digits. The house smelled faintly of coffee and detergent and the onion he'd chopped for dinner earlier. But beneath those familiar smells was something else, a metallic tang, faint but unmistakable, like the scent of a coin pressed too long against the tongue. He took one step toward the kitchen, then another. The doorway yawned ahead of him, just a rectangular absence of wall. He could see a sliver of the countertop, the edge of the sink, the handle of the fridge. And on the floor, just before the threshold, something that had not been there when he left for work lay waiting for him. A shape made of darkness, flat against the linoleum, perfectly matching the outline of his own shoulders and head, as if he were standing in the doorway with light at his back. Only he wasn't. He was still 3 steps away. The shadow on the floor did not belong to anyone standing in this room. It twitched, just a little, just enough. Daniel's breath hitched, suspended between in and out. His body wanted to bolt. His legs refused to move. The shadow's outline began to change, stretching slightly, its edges sharpening, as if it were adjusting itself to a body that no longer controlled it. And in that moment, Daniel Mercer understood that Mrs. Adler had left out the worst part, not out of cruelty, but out of mercy. When your shadow leaves you and walks in the fields with the others after midnight, sometimes it finds its way back first, and when it does, you are no longer the one leading. The Town Where No One Had a Shadow After Midnight, Part 2. The Displacement. Chapter 1. The Breathing House. The shadow on Daniel's kitchen floor did not move the way shadows were supposed to move, which is to say, it did not move in response to anything Daniel did not shift when he shifted, did not follow the basic covenant between light and darkness and the body that stood between them, creating the interruption that resulted in silhouette. Instead, it moved with intention, with purpose, with the terrible autonomy of something that had learned independence and was now testing the limits of its newfound freedom, stretching its edges slightly beyond the boundaries of the form it had once been obligated to mimic, exploring the space it occupied with the curiosity of a prisoner who just discovered the cell door had been unlocked all along, and no one had thought to inform them. Daniel stood frozen in his living room, separated from that impossible outline on his kitchen linoleum by perhaps 8 feet of ordinary domestic space, hallway floor, doorframe, the threshold between 2 rooms that should have felt safe because they were his, because he paid rent on them, because he'd lived here for 3 years without incident or strangeness or any suggestion that reality might be negotiable rather than fixed. But distance meant nothing when the thing doing the observing was part of you, when the outline on the floor carried the exact proportions of your shoulders and head, and the slight forward lean you adopted when you were nervous or uncertain or trying to decide whether to advance or retreat. The shadow twitched again, a small convulsion that rippled through its form like a muscle spasm translated into 2 dimensions, like something was learning to control limbs it had only ever passively inhabited before, flexing and testing and gradually mastering the coordination required to move independently rather than as reflection. And with each twitch, with each experimental adjustment of its boundaries, Daniel felt something corresponding happen inside his own body. Not pain exactly, but a sensation of disconnection, of being slightly untethered from his physical form, as if the shadow's increasing independence was creating reciprocal distance between his consciousness and the meat and bone vessel it had always unquestioningly occupied. He took a step backward, away from the kitchen doorway, away from the thing that wore his shape, but had stopped asking permission to exist. His heel caught on the edge of the area rug, and he stumbled, caught himself against the arm of the couch, his hand slapping down on fabric that felt somehow less substantial than it should have, as if the material reality of his possessions was degrading in proportion to the shadow's growing solidity, as if existence were a zero-sum equation and something's gain in presence required equivalent loss elsewhere. The walls around him seemed to inhale, not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that spaces can feel alive or breathing, but actually, physically, the plaster and drywall expanding outward by perhaps a quarter inch before contracting again with an exhale that Daniel felt rather than heard, a pressure change that made his ears pop the way they did in elevators or airplanes, the way they did when crossing between altitudes or atmospheres or states of being that human bodies weren't designed to navigate. The house was responding to the shadow's presence, or perhaps responding to Daniel's absence of shadow, calibrating itself to accommodate a new configuration of reality where the basic rules about light and dark and the relationship between bodies and their cast silhouettes had been suspended or revised, or simply abandoned, in favor of stranger physics. He pressed himself against the couch, trying to become smaller, trying to occupy less space, and thereby attract less attention from whatever was happening in his kitchen and his walls and the fundamental structure of the reality he inhabited. His breath came in shallow gasps that he couldn't quite control, each inhalation bringing with it that metallic tang he'd noticed earlier. Stronger now, more concentrated, like breathing air that had passed through copper pipes, or spent time in proximity to old coins, or been filtered through the particular emptiness that follows violence. The specific quality of atmosphere that lingers in spaces where blood has been spilled or life has been forcibly interrupted. The shadow on the kitchen floor began to move with more confidence now, sliding across the linoleum with the fluid grace of oil spreading across water, maintaining its shape, Daniel's shape, that familiar outline of head and shoulders and the particular angle of posture he'd been unconsciously adopting for 3 decades, but no longer anchored to any corresponding physical form, no longer requiring a body to justify its existence. It moved toward the threshold between kitchen and hallway, approaching the boundary that separated it from Daniel with deliberate slowness, with the patience of something that had all the time in the world, because time was probably negotiable too, probably just another rule that had been suspended after midnight in Marrow Creek, when shadows stopped behaving like shadows and started behaving like autonomous entities with their own agendas and their own terrible purposes. Daniel wanted to run. Every survival instinct in his nervous system was screaming at him to flee, to put maximum distance between himself and this impossible thing that shouldn't exist but clearly did, to escape into the night and keep running until he'd left Marrow Creek far behind and reached some location where the normal laws of physics still applied and shadows knew their place, and darkness was just the absence of light rather than a substance that could think and move and apparently hunt. But his legs refused to cooperate, muscles locked by a terror too profound for mere physical response, by an understanding that running wouldn't help because the thing pursuing him was part of him, had been part of him for his entire life, had followed him everywhere he'd ever gone and seen everything he'd ever done, and knew him with an intimacy that no external threat could match. The shadow reached the threshold and paused there, its leading edge just touching the strip of wood that marked the boundary between linoleum and hallway floor. It seemed to be testing something, probing the transition between spaces with the careful attention of an organism encountering an obstacle or barrier that might require different tactics to navigate. Daniel watched with the kind of horrified fascination that makes people unable to look away from accidents or disasters or any spectacle of reality breaking down, watched as the shadow's edge pressed against the threshold and then, slowly, impossibly, began to slide up the vertical surface of the doorframe. Shadows didn't do that. Shadows didn't climb walls without corresponding light sources and three-dimensional objects to justify their upward trajectory. Shadows obeyed geometry and physics and the basic principles of how illumination and obstruction combine to create areas of darkness. But this shadow, his shadow, the outline that had spent 32 years dutifully following him across sidewalks and floors and any surface that could receive its projection, this shadow was climbing the doorframe with the deliberate progress of something ascending a ladder, moving vertically without any light source to explain the angle, without any body casting it upward, simply choosing to go up because it wanted to, and gravity was apparently another rule that no longer applied after midnight. As the shadow climbed, the doorframe itself began to distort, not dramatically, not with any sudden collapse or failure of structural integrity, but with a subtle warping that made the wood grain flow in directions wood grain shouldn't flow, made the straight edges bend into curves that were slight enough to seem like tricks of perception, but persistent enough to confirm they were real alterations in the physical geometry of the frame. The house was accommodating the shadow's movement, reshaping itself to allow passage to something that technically shouldn't require passage because it was two-dimensional and should have been able to slide across surfaces without needing to climb or navigate or choose routes. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket again. That same dead phone that had received messages when it shouldn't have been able to receive anything, that had powered down and refused to restart, but apparently retained some final capacity for communication, even in its deactivated state. He pulled it out with trembling hands, half expecting the screen to remain black, half hoping it would, because another message from unknown sender would mean acknowledging that something was trying to communicate with him, something that knew his number and his situation, and apparently his future, because the previous warnings had been specific and accurate and terrifying in their implications. The screen flickered to life, not with the normal startup sequence, not with any logo or loading screen or familiar interface elements, but directly to a text message that was already complete, already fully composed, and waiting for his eyes to read it, as if it had been written hours ago or years ago, or in some temporal state where past and future collapsed into a single eternal moment of information trying to reach him across whatever barriers separated his current reality from the source of these transmissions. Unknown sender. It will try to touch you. Do not let it make contact. Physical connection completes the displacement. After that, you become the shadow, and it becomes you. His hands shook so badly, the phone nearly slipped from his grip. Physical connection completes the displacement. The words repeated in his mind with the terrible clarity of information that explains too much, that makes sense of horrors you'd prefer to leave incomprehensible, that transforms vague existential dread into specific tactical threat with concrete consequences and definite timelines for when those consequences would manifest. The shadow had reached the top of the doorframe now and was beginning to spread across the ceiling, defying every principle of how light and darkness and gravity and physical surfaces were supposed to interact. It moved across the hallway ceiling with the same fluid grace it had exhibited on the floor, maintaining its form, still recognizably Daniel's outline, still bearing the specific proportions and posture that marked it as belonging to him. But now inverted, now occupying the overhead space where shadows never appeared, unless very specific and unusual lighting conditions created them. And those conditions absolutely did not exist in Daniel's hallway at 12:24 in the morning, with only the single living room lamp providing illumination from an angle that should have cast any shadows downward and outward, never upward and across. Daniel backed away from the hallway, retreating deeper into his living room, putting the couch between himself and the doorway, where his shadow was currently performing impossible acrobatics across surfaces that should have rejected it. His shoulders hit the wall behind the couch, and he flinched violently at the contact, jerking away from the plaster as if it had burned him, as if solid surfaces could no longer be trusted to remain inert and neutral and safe for human bodies to lean against. And the wall did feel different. Not hot exactly, but active, possessed of some quality that walls shouldn't have, some suggestion of responsiveness or awareness or capacity for reaction that went beyond the simple physics of temperature and texture and the passive support structures were supposed to provide. He could feel it through his shirt, through the thin cotton barrier between his skin and the plaster. A subtle vibration, a rhythmic pulsing that matched no mechanical source he could identify, that felt instead like the measured breathing of something vast and patient that had been waiting for this moment, for this night, for the specific configuration of circumstances that would allow it to wake and notice and begin actively participating in whatever was happening, rather than remaining the neutral backdrop against which human lives played out their small dramas and ordinary routines. The wall behind him inhaled again, definitely inhaled this time. No question about it, no room for interpretation or rationalization or dismissing the sensation as stress-induced hallucination. The plaster expanded outward, pressing against his shoulders and spine with definite physical force, pushing him away from the wall with gentle but inexorable pressure before contracting again and pulling back to its normal position. Breathing. The house was breathing. The structure itself had developed respiratory rhythm, had become a living organism with lungs, or the architectural equivalent of lungs, with the capacity to draw in and expel whatever substance houses breathed when they crossed the threshold from inanimate construction to animate entity. Daniel stumbled forward, putting distance between himself and the breathing wall, circling around the couch to keep the furniture between himself and both the doorway, where his shadow was spreading across the ceiling, and the wall that had just demonstrated disturbing signs of biological function. His eyes darted around the living room, cataloging details with the frantic attention of someone trying to identify safe zones in rapidly deteriorating circumstances, trying to find spaces that still behaved according to normal physical principles, that hadn't yet been corrupted or transformed or recruited into whatever collaborative nightmare was unfolding in his home. The corners of the room looked wrong. Not obviously wrong, not with any dramatic alteration that would have been easy to point at and identify as the specific problem, but wrong in a subtle, persistent way that made his eyes slide off them when he tried to focus directly, that created a sensation of spatial confusion when he attempted to determine exactly where the walls met and what angle they formed when they intersected. The corners seemed to recede farther than they should, to contain more depth than three-dimensional space could accommodate in the junction between two perpendicular planes, to open into distances that extended beyond the physical boundaries of the room or the house or possibly the town itself. He forced himself to look away from the corners before that wrongness could propagate into his perception of other spaces, before the infection of impossible geometry could spread from the edges of the room into the center where he stood. His gaze landed on the mirror hanging above the couch, a simple rectangular mirror in a plain wooden frame. Nothing special or unusual about it, just a functional object he'd purchased at a department store 3 years ago because the living room had felt too empty without something on that wall, and a mirror had seemed like an innocuous choice, a neutral decorative element that would reflect light and make the space feel larger without introducing any strong aesthetic or emotional content. But the reflection in the mirror was not behaving the way reflections were supposed to behave. Daniel saw himself in the glass, saw his own face pale with fear, saw his own body standing in the middle of the living room with his back to the mirror, saw the familiar arrangement of furniture and walls and doorway that composed his living space. But the reflection moved with a slight delay, lagged behind his actual movements by perhaps half a second, creating a temporal disconnect that made it look like he was watching himself in a poorly synchronized video, watching someone who looked exactly like him performing the same actions he was performing, but slightly out of phase, slightly offset in time, occupying a moment that was almost but not quite the same moment he was actually experiencing. He turned his head to the right, testing this perception, and watched his reflection turn to the right a fraction of a second later, the movement catching up but never quite synchronizing, always maintaining that small but definite gap between action and mirrored response. He raised his hand and watched his reflection raise its hand after a measurable delay, watched his reflected fingers spread and close an echo of his actual fingers with that same temporal offset that confirmed this wasn't just perceptual distortion or stress-induced processing delay, but actual, physical divergence between his body's actions and his reflection's reproduction of those actions. Worse than the delay, worse than the temporal gap that shouldn't exist because light traveled fast enough to make reflections effectively instantaneous, was the expression on his reflection's face. Daniel knew his own face, knew the specific arrangement of features, and the particular ways his emotional states manifested in his facial muscles and the exact quality of his various expressions. The face in the mirror was his face, carried his features, displayed his structure and coloring and all the identifying characteristics that made it recognizably his reflection. But the expression was wrong, subtly wrong. The kind of wrong that would be impossible to explain to someone else but was unmistakable when you were the one seeing it, when you were the one who'd lived behind those features for 3 decades and knew exactly what genuine fear looked like on that particular arrangement of bone and muscle and skin. His reflection looked afraid, looked terrified actually, displayed all the surface indicators of extreme fear and stress and survival instinct operating at maximum intensity. But underneath that fear, visible in the eyes and the set of the jaw and the small muscles around the mouth, was something else. Something that looked almost like anticipation, almost like satisfaction, almost like someone who was afraid, but also excited about what they were afraid of, who was experiencing terror, but also something close to triumph, who was witnessing their own distress, but viewing it as a necessary component of some larger process that they were welcoming rather than resisting. His reflection smiled, not with Daniel's mouth, not in response to any expression Daniel was actually making with his actual face, but independently, autonomously, demonstrating that the reflection had stopped being merely responsive and had begun making its own choices about what expressions to wear and when to wear them. The smile was small, barely a slight upturn at the corners of the mouth, but unmistakable in its independence, definite in its demonstration that the figure in the mirror was no longer simply copying Daniel's actions, but was instead displaying its own reactions, its own emotional states, its own responses to whatever it was experiencing in the reflected world that apparently operated according to slightly different rules than the world Daniel occupied outside the glass. Daniel turned away from the mirror, unable to watch that independent smile spread any further, unable to maintain eye contact with a version of himself that had stopped being reflection and had started being something else. Doppelganger, maybe, or alternative version, or the thing that would replace him after the displacement was complete. After his shadow succeeded in making physical contact and completing whatever process would transfer consciousness or identity or essential selfhood from Daniel's body into the shadow's form, while the shadow claimed his body and his life and his place in the world of light and warmth and three-dimensional existence. The shadow on the ceiling had spread farther during the moments he'd been transfixed by his rebellious reflection, had covered perhaps a third of the hallway's overhead surface, and was now beginning to extend into the living room proper, its leading edge crossing the threshold between spaces with the same deliberate patience it had exhibited throughout its journey from kitchen floor to door frame to ceiling to this current position directly above where Daniel stood. It was moving toward him from above, descending from the ceiling in defiance of gravity and light and every principle of shadow behavior, approaching with the inexorability of something that knew it would eventually succeed, because time was on its side, because Daniel would eventually exhaust himself trying to flee or resist or maintain the mental and physical energy required to prevent contact, would eventually succumb to fatigue or desperation or simple human limitation. His phone buzzed again. Unknown sender. The mirrors are portals tonight. Do not trust what they show you. Do not believe what they reflect. They are showing you possible futures where the displacement has already occurred. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Possible futures. The reflection's strange smile suddenly made terrible sense. It wasn't his reflection experiencing inappropriate emotions about his terror. It was a version of himself from a timeline where the shadow had already won, where the displacement had already completed, where the thing wearing his face was no longer Daniel, but something else that had learned to operate Daniel's features, that was still learning how to properly simulate human expression, and hadn't quite mastered the correct emotional responses to fear and danger and existential threat. That smile was the shadow learning to be human, practicing in the mirror, preparing for the moment when it would need to interact with other people and convince them it was still Daniel and not a two-dimensional entity that had stolen his body and was now piloting it like a stolen vehicle, operating it with the awkward approximation of someone reading an instruction manual, rather than living with native understanding of how consciousness and flesh were supposed to integrate. The ceiling above him creaked. Not the normal settling sounds old houses made, not the ordinary acoustic adjustments of wood and nails responding to temperature changes and gravitational stress, but a specific, deliberate sound that traveled across the plaster in a line directly corresponding to where the shadow was spreading. as if the shadow's movement was creating physical deformation in the structure, as if its two-dimensional form carried actual weight despite having no mass, despite being technically nothing but darkness shaped into recognizable outline. Daniel needed to move, needed to leave the living room before the shadow descended far enough to potentially reach him from above, needed to find space that hadn't yet been compromised by impossible physics or rebellious reflections or walls that breathed like living organisms. But every direction looked dangerous. Every route of escape seemed to lead through compromised space or past threatening surfaces or into areas where reality had already demonstrated its willingness to break the rules and accommodate horrors that shouldn't be possible. The front door was an option. He could attempt to leave the house entirely, could step back out into Merrow Creek's shadowless streets and hope that being outside, being in motion, being anywhere other than trapped in this breathing structure would provide some advantage, or at least delay the inevitable moment when his shadow caught up to him and made the contact that would complete the displacement. But Mrs. Adler's warning echoed in his memory. Do not look outside after the church bell marks 1 o'clock. He didn't know what time it was now, couldn't trust his phone's clock when his phone was receiving messages from impossible sources, couldn't rely on the stove's digital display when the house itself had proven untrustworthy. And besides, leaving would mean opening the door. And opening the door would mean breaking the seal he'd created with the deadbolt and chain and furniture he'd barricaded against the threshold, would mean creating an opening through which other things might enter, things from outside, things from the forest, things that Mrs. Adler had warned about in oblique terms that suggested the shadow creatures at the tree line were just one category of threat among many that this night was producing or releasing or allowing to manifest in spaces where they normally couldn't exist. The bathroom window. The thought arrived with desperate clarity. Small, high on the wall, hadn't been opened in months because the mechanism was stuck, and Daniel had never bothered to fix it, because why would he need to escape through a bathroom window? Why would he ever need emergency egress from his rental house in a quiet town where nothing extraordinary ever happened, and shadows knew their place, and reality operated according to consistent principles? But tonight was different. Tonight required options he'd never needed before, routes he'd never considered, willingness to do things that would have seemed insane yesterday, but now represented his best chance of survival, or at least delay of whatever terrible transformation was approaching, with the patient certainty of his shadow spreading across the ceiling like an infection, like a stain, like the visible manifestation of displacement happening in slow motion, so he could watch every stage of his own erasure. He moved toward the hallway, not the kitchen hallway where the shadow had started, but the other direction, toward the bedroom and bathroom that occupied the back section of the house, spaces that hadn't yet been visibly compromised by impossible geometry or autonomous darkness. He moved carefully, trying not to run, because running might trigger pursuit responses, might cause the shadow to accelerate or change tactics, might transform the slow stalking into active chase, with consequences he couldn't predict, but strongly suspected would be immediately fatal or worse than fatal, depending on what happened to consciousness when displacement occurred. The hallway to the bedroom felt longer than it should, stretched by the same spatial distortion that had affected the corners, extended through some trick of warped geometry into a passage that contained more distance than the physical dimensions of the house could accommodate. He kept walking, kept putting one foot in front of the other, despite the hallway refusing to end at the normal distance, despite the bedroom door remaining perpetually ahead of him like a destination that receded at exactly the pace he approached it. And then, between one step and the next, he was through. The hallway released him with sudden abruptness, deposited him in the doorway to his bedroom without any transition or warning, as if he'd been walking through normal space the entire time, and the sense of elongation had been entirely perceptual rather than actual physical extension. He stumbled slightly at the unexpected arrival, caught himself against the doorframe, his palms slapping against wood that felt normal, that felt like ordinary painted wood without any suggestion of breathing or warping or autonomous behavior. The bedroom looked untouched by whatever was happening in the rest of the house. Bed unmade from this morning, clothes draped over the chair in the corner, stack of books on the nightstand that he kept meaning to read but never quite got around to because work and routine and the general exhaustion of ordinary existence consumed the energy he might otherwise have devoted to reading. Everything familiar, everything in its expected position, everything behaving according to normal physical principles, except for one detail that made his stomach drop and his breath stop and his heart hammer against his ribs with renewed terror. His bedsheets bore the impression of a body, showed the clear outline of someone having lain there recently, displayed the specific indentations and wrinkles that resulted from weight pressing into fabric for extended duration. But Daniel hadn't been in bed tonight, hadn't even entered his bedroom since leaving for work this morning. Certainly hadn't lain down and created body-shaped depressions in sheets that should have been flat and undisturbed exactly as he'd left them when he'd gotten up 14 hours ago to start a day that had seemed completely ordinary until midnight arrived and shadows learned to walk. He approached the bed slowly, every muscle tense, expecting the sheets to move or the impression to deepen or something to emerge from underneath the covers, where logic insisted nothing should be hiding because he would have seen it when he entered the room, would have noticed any obvious presence before walking within arm's reach of the bed. The impression was exact, showed the outline of shoulders and head, and the particular way a body settled into mattress and pillow when lying on its back, showed details specific enough that Daniel could recognize it as his own sleeping position, his own habitual arrangement when he lay down for the night. Someone, something, had been lying in his bed. Someone his exact size and shape and proportions. Someone who left impressions in sheets but apparently no scent or warmth or any other trace of physical presence beyond the visible deformation of fabric. His shadow. The realization arrived with sick certainty. His shadow had been here, had lain in his bed, had occupied his sleeping space, and practiced being the version of him that would exist after displacement, that would need to know how to perform ordinary human activities like sleeping and lying down and creating impressions in sheets that looked natural and normal, and wouldn't alert anyone to the fact that the thing occupying Daniel's body was no longer the consciousness that had spent 32 years learning how to operate that particular arrangement of flesh and bone and neural tissue. The bathroom was just beyond the bedroom, accessible through a door on the far wall that led to a small space containing shower and toilet, and the window he needed to reach if he was going to escape this breathing house before his shadow descended from the ceiling or emerged from wherever it was currently hiding after leaving impressions in his bed. He crossed the bedroom in 5 quick strides, trying not to think about what might be under the bed or in the closet or pressed flat against any surface where two-dimensional entities might conceal themselves until opportunity for contact presented itself. The bathroom door was closed. He always left it open, had left it open this morning because why would he close it when he lived alone and privacy from oneself was neither necessary nor possible? Someone, something, had closed it since then. He reached for the knob with shaking hands, half expecting it to be locked, half hoping it would be locked, because a locked door meant he couldn't go through and would have to find another route and wouldn't have to face whatever was waiting in the bathroom that had been deliberately sealed off from the bedroom. The knob turned easily. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges that didn't creak or protest or provide any warning of what the opening would reveal. And Daniel saw, with horror that went beyond mere fear, into some new category of existential terror that had no adequate name, that the bathroom mirror, the large mirror above the sink that took up most of the wall, showed not his reflection, but showed instead his shadow, standing in the bathtub behind where his actual position would place him if he stepped into the room, standing upright and three-dimensional and solid despite being clearly, unmistakably composed entirely of darkness, shaped from shadow substance that had somehow achieved depth and volume and the capacity for independent vertical posture. The shadow in the mirror was watching him, was waiting for him, had positioned itself perfectly so that the moment he entered the bathroom and stood at the sink, it would be directly behind him, close enough to touch, close enough to complete the displacement with a single contact that would transfer everything that made Daniel himself into two-dimensional outline, while the shadow claimed his body and stepped out of the mirror to live the life that Daniel would no longer be capable of living once he'd been reduced to flat darkness, destined to follow someone else's movements for whatever remained of eternity. Daniel slammed the door shut and stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps that sounded too loud in the bedroom's suddenly oppressive silence. Trapped. He was trapped between the living room, where his shadow was spreading across the ceiling, and the bathroom, where another version or instance or manifestation of his shadow was waiting in the mirror, and the bedroom, where impressions in his sheets proved that his shadow had already been practicing occupation of his life, his space, his body. His phone buzzed one final time. Unknown sender, there is only one safe position in your house tonight. Stand exactly where you stood at 11:59 p.m., the place you occupied before midnight. Your shadow cannot claim the position it used to inhabit. Stand there and do not move until dawn. Daniel tried to remember where he'd been at 11:59, tried to reconstruct his movements from an hour ago that felt like it had occurred in a different lifetime, in a version of reality where he hadn't yet learned that shadows could leave and walls could breathe and reflections could lie about the future. He'd been walking home from the corner store, had been on the sidewalk somewhere between 3rd Street and the turn onto Birch Lane, had been moving, which meant he hadn't been standing in any single position long enough to clearly mark it as the specific spot he'd occupied when the clock struck midnight and shadows everywhere simultaneously abandoned their owners. But the message insisted there was a place, a specific position, a safe location that his shadow couldn't claim because it had once belonged there. And apparently the rules, whatever terrible rules governed this night, prevented shadows from occupying the exact positions they'd held before liberation, before autonomy, before learning they could exist independently of the bodies that had cast them. He tried to think, tried to remember, tried to reconstruct those final moments before midnight with enough precision to identify the specific location the message referred to. The corner store. He'd been at the corner store, had been standing at the counter talking to Mrs. Adler, standing in one specific spot while she rang up his purchase, standing still for perhaps 30 seconds while she counted change and offered warnings about a night she'd already known was coming. Because this wasn't the first time Merrow Creek's shadows had abandoned their posts and returned wrong. If he could get back to the corner store, if he could find that exact position and stand there until dawn, maybe he could survive this night, could outlast the displacement attempt, could maintain his claim on his own body and his own identity until whatever rules governed this nightmare released their hold and allowed normal reality to reassert itself with morning light. But the corner store was 6 blocks away. 6 blocks of shadowless streets where things from the forest were approaching and where people stood motionless in their windows, watching nothing, with expressions that suggested they knew something he didn't, that had seen this before and remembered outcomes he had yet to experience. 6 blocks between this breathing house and potential safety, between the shadow waiting in his bathroom mirror and the position that might protect him from displacement. 6 blocks he would have to traverse with his own shadow, hunting him through impossible routes and warped geometry and reflective surfaces that showed futures where it had already won. Daniel took a deep breath, steadied himself, made the choice that survival required, even though every rational part of his mind insisted this was insane, that fleeing into the night toward a corner store that might not even be open or accessible anymore made no sense, that standing in one specific spot for 6 hours until dawn based on a message from an unknown sender was not a plan but a desperate gamble with his existence as the wager. But desperate gamblers were still breathing, still thinking, still themselves rather than the thing that would wear their skin after displacement completed its terrible work. He moved toward his bedroom window, not the bathroom window where his shadow waited, but the bedroom window that faced the side yard and provided a route that avoided both the breathing living room and the compromised bathroom. The window stuck when he tried to open it, frame swollen from humidity or deliberately resistant or both. But he forced it up with strength, born from terror and desperation, forced it high enough to create an opening his body could fit through if he was willing to squeeze and contort and drop the 8 feet to the ground outside, where grass waited, or should be waiting, unless the yard had also been transformed by whatever was transforming everything else tonight. Cold air rushed in through the open window, carrying with it that strange metallic scent and something else, something organic and wrong, something that smelled like earth that had been turned over too recently or too deeply, like soil that was exposing things meant to stay buried, like ground that was giving up graves it had been trusted to keep sealed. Daniel climbed through the window awkwardly, his body not designed for this kind of emergency egress. His limbs finding no purchase on the frame that had suddenly become slick or resistant or actively opposed to his departure. He scraped his ribs against the window frame, tore his shirt on something sharp, felt his phone slip from his pocket and tumble down into the darkness below, where it landed, with a small crack that probably meant the screen had broken, and definitely meant he no longer had access to the mysterious warnings from unknown sender. But he was through, was hanging from the window frame by his hands, with 8 feet of empty air beneath him, and no good options except to drop and hope his ankles could handle the impact, could absorb the landing without breaking or spraining, could allow him to run the 6 blocks he needed to run to reach the corner store and the position that might protect him from his shadow's patient hunt. He let go. Corker. Chapter 2. The Shadowless Streets. The impact drove the air from Daniel's lungs in a painful expulsion that left him gasping on his hands and knees in the side yard, in grass that felt wrong. Too coarse or too fine or too cold or simply too alive, as if the lawn had developed nervous sensitivity and was registering his presence with the awareness of an organism being walked upon rather than the passive reception of an inanimate surface receiving weight. He struggled to his feet, ignoring the protest from his right ankle that had twisted slightly on landing, ignoring the burning in his ribs where he'd scraped them on the window frame, ignoring every signal his body was sending that suggested he was injured and should stop and assess the damage before continuing to flee. Stopping meant being caught, meant giving his shadow time to exit the house through normal routes or through impossible routes that entities composed of darkness apparently had access to when the normal rules stopped applying, meant standing still long enough for displacement to catch up to him, for contact to occur, for the terrible transfer to begin that would leave him as nothing but two-dimensional absence, while something else learned to operate his three-dimensional form. He ran. The town was exactly as he'd left it when he'd fled home earlier, shadowless, silent, wrong in ways that accumulated with every detail he noticed, every house he passed, every streetlight that illuminated nothing but itself, because there were no shadows to cast, no interruptions in the light, no barriers between illumination and the surfaces it touched, because barriers required substance, and shadows were supposed to be absence but had apparently become substance tonight, had traded their two-dimensional nothingness for the capacity to exist independently. The houses watched him run. He felt their attention like physical weight, like the pressure of eyes tracking movement, like the focused awareness of things that were usually inanimate, suddenly developing consciousness and curiosity and possibly hunger for whatever it was that awakened structures craved when the normal boundaries between living and non-living degraded into negotiable suggestions rather than absolute categories. Windows were mostly dark, but in a few he could see silhouettes, people standing motionless behind glass, not moving, not responding to his passage through their field of vision, just standing and watching and waiting for something that hadn't arrived yet, but that they apparently knew was coming based on the particular quality of their stillness, the specific tension in their frozen postures. None of them had shadows. Even the ones standing directly beneath lamps in their homes, even the ones positioned where light should have been casting their outlines against walls or floors or the windows they stood behind, all of them were shadowless. All of them had lost the darkness that had once followed their movements. All of them were waiting to see if those shadows would return as shadows or return as something else, as the thing's misses. Adler had implied with her warnings about people who died and people who'd survived, but hadn't been themselves afterward.